My name is Steve Baker. I'm the principal architect of Baker Architects. I have been serving the Catholic Church and her architectural needs for 20 years now. I've worked on anything from fonts to basilicas to cathedrals to parish churches to shrines. I began my studies at the University of Colorado at Denver with my master's degree in architecture. And when I graduated, I was given the opportunity to work with an architect who worked on Catholic churches across the nation. And straight out of graduate school, I was thrown into these wonderful churches, and I was asked to go through these churches and offer designs that would present a Catholic church. Naively, I thought I knew exactly what I was doing. But as I found as I went through it, I needed to have a little bit more understanding of exactly what we were trying to do when we're making a Catholic church. So that quest to try to answer this question of what exactly is a Catholic church and how do we design for that, it brought me to my PhD at the University of Colorado at Denver. Currently working on my dissertation and hope to defend it in fall. So the goal of my research is to provide practical answers and guidance for pastors, parishioners, laity, and architects who are charged with building a Catholic church. So enough about me, let's go ahead and get started on what makes a Catholic church Catholic. So as you might have guessed, this question is a rather enormous question, and there's probably 1,000 different answers for how you could define what exactly makes a Catholic church a Catholic church. For what exactly makes a Catholic church Catholic. However, I have been able to find through my research a key principle that Catholicism is trying to express, and it kind of shows up throughout all of its history. And in fact, it's a key principle within the Catholicism that makes it unique between other denominations and other faiths and other belief systems and other religions. So the first thing I did is to look at the history of architecture and see if there were any enduring patterns. Then the goal was to find out what were these patterns trying to express, and was there any commonality between all of them, enduring patterns that always persisted throughout all of our Catholic churches. So you can see across several of these are just examples of Byzantine, Romanesque, stave churches, Gothic churches. And we even have our postmodern churches. This is the Jubilee Church in Rome that was commissioned by the Vatican in about 2002. This is the Cathedral of the Angels in Los Angeles, and as you can see, there is a plethora of different forms and means of expressing Catholicism. However, I will argue that some of these churches express them a little bit more clearly than others, and some are expressing ideas that are not normally expressed in Catholicism. So as we started going through and understanding what it is about a Catholic church, I come across the question of why did God make man or woman? It gets to a very fundamental question throughout all of philosophy in that regards. In the Baltimore Catechism of the Catholic Church, the first and primary answer to this question is, God made me to know him, to love him, and to serve him in this world, and to be happy with him forever in heaven. And this claim is also reiterated in the prologue of the more recent Catechism of the Catholic Church, in which it states, God calls man to seek him, to know him, to love him with all his strength. I don't know about you, but I do find that seems to be a little bit of a difficult thing to understand. That is, how is God, an infinite being, knowable by finite creatures? And I found that this question is one that is a very perennial question throughout all of history, and one that is sought to be answered by many philosophers, and one of them here is Nicholas of Cusa, where he offered the suggestion that knowing God with the human mind is not possible through mere human means. For Cusa, he called that we required a learned ignorance. When we contemplate the infinite and our human reason reaches its limit, we must step back in learned ignorance. He describes these paradoxes as the enfolding and the unfolding of divine oneness. In fact, as my research continued on, I found that there were many paradoxes throughout all of Catholicism. In fact, all of our day-to-day experiences were filled with meaning between binary oppositions. So throughout our day, we experience many different kind of paradoxes: up versus down, left versus right, stop versus go, self versus other, man versus God, virgin versus birth, and the saints who are pacifists and saints who are warriors. We also have the one of heaven and hell. Bishop Barone calls these the vibrant paradoxes, the both and of Catholicism. And in fact, Catholicism is able to keep these paradoxes in tension, and from that tension they radiate light in all directions. So somehow Catholicism is able to take paradoxes such as these and develop them into meaningful understandings and live within the both and the and of these paradoxes. In fact, there's actually an architectural paradox in the Sacrosanctum Concilium and the U.S. Council of Bishops' General Instruction of the Roman Missal, they both claim that sacred architecture is to express the signs and symbols of heavenly realities. So architects are been given this task of being able to manifest in built form signs and symbols of a heavenly reality. How do we do that? I also found that one of the most fundamental paradoxes of Catholicism was the Incarnation. In John 1:14, John states, "The Word became flesh and dwelt among us." God decided to make himself known to us and accessible to us in and through material things. This incarnational principle is the basis for all of the sacraments. I also discovered through a lot of my research there was many philosophers talking about this idea that there's a Catholic imagination or a Catholic means of figuring their world. And this Catholic imagination is based off the Incarnation. In fact, Blessed John Henry Newman identified the Incarnation as absolutely fundamental to the Catholic sensibility. So John's passage is the key we will use to unlock what makes a Catholic Church Catholic. That is, the Word became flesh. So my thesis is the Catholic sacred architecture is distinguished by the dynamic interplay between formal and figural architectural languages. And at first glance, you can see that that thesis is very wordy, which usually PhD dissertations are, very lengthy and very wordy. But I want to explain this by this diagram that I have here. This was a crucifix that we received in the mail. And as a Catholic, we receive a lot of these things for donations. We'll receive Christmas cards and medals and images and small little trinkets like this that basically have very little monetary value. But I do find that when I receive these in the mail, I am basically unable to throw away the elements that have figures on them. Now, if you look at this image here that I've demonstrated, on the left-hand side we have a crucifix with the corpus on it, and I have progressed it from the left to the right, going to a little bit more abstraction each step. And you can see in the second image, we've taken all the recognizable figures off of the cross, and now we have just two pieces of wood that have a base that still resembles somewhat of a cross. The third image basically has taken all the three-dimensionality out of it and flattened down the image. It still has a little bit of the wood materiality to it, so it still has a sense of a wood cross. And you see in the final image, we have our formal shape and the color of it. At this point, it's been completely extracted out to pure form. So you can see on the left-hand side, we're talking about a figural expression, and on the far right-hand side, we're talking about the formal expression. Another way to understand this is on the left-hand side, we have corporal expression, and on the far right-hand side, we have a schematic expression. As I continued through my research, I discovered that the Catholic imagination embraces figural languages for expression, and it really embraces the idea of keeping the figure on the cross. In fact, one of the main characteristics of a Catholic Church is that it does have a crucifix in it with the corpus on it. And one of the other prime characteristics of a Protestant church is just the cross. Now, if you look at the two extremes, the left-hand image and the far right-hand image, you immediately can be able to feel a sense of connection and adoration or empathy with the one on the left. On the right-hand side, you can see that this could be easily just two black lines and not have any other really deeper meaning to it. So there is something about the figural languages that allows a person to connect to and relate to. And what this diagram illustrates is the progression from a purely figural description on the left-hand side to a much more schematic description on the right-hand side. Another way to interpret this would be that the left-hand side is the flesh and the right-hand side would be the Word. So in this case, we would have the combination of the two, and Catholicism is always trying to connect the Word, which would be the right-hand side image, with the flesh, which is the left-hand side image. And in fact, in order for us to get to the understanding of the Word, which is a very mental and formal concept, we typically will have to go through the flesh and understand it through a connatural knowledge to get to a conceptual knowledge, which is on the right-hand side. That is the typical process that Catholicism and Catholic sacred architecture proceeds. So it usually proceeds from a figural procession into a more formal understanding of it. And you'll see this throughout most of all the architecture. And in fact, with this understanding, we can also see that postmodernism and even modernism has basically reversed the process. They have basically taken form and made it into figure. This is primarily done by the removal of ornamentation. In fact, you can say that modernism is just the form on the right-hand side trying to get to the more essence of what a building is. And in fact, you can say that postmodernism is basically purely just the figural expression of it without any formal understanding of it. And to demonstrate this, I'll use a couple case study analysis where I'll demonstrate the traditional method of having a formal underlying structure that has been infigured, so that when you experience the church, you're going through a figural progression towards the formal end. And then I'll contrast this with two other case studies where we have basically the formal expression without any figural expression, and then we'll also have a figural expression without any formal understanding of it. All right, so let's continue this discussion on the figural versus formal understanding of how architecture can express ideas. So in this diagram, I have on the left-hand side the idea of a pure form, and in this case we have a Euclidean cube or a square. That in the next step we have form plus figure. So these first two images here, the left and the right, are expressing a very traditional and classical way of expressing form. So from this worldview, you're saying that there are universal forms and there are ideal forms, so it's very Platonic. So in this case, we have the form, the square, and then traditionally that will then be expressed or form or infigured or infleshed. So elements that make up the square will then become expressed or become more visible through transformations or fractals or ornamentation, or sometimes even figures. So you can see in here, this is a very traditional idea of the word becoming flesh. You can see in the next two steps, basically what has happened in the modern movement and also the postmodern movement is that we've basically atomized the form. So you can see in here, it's an approach to taking or destroying the box, would be kind of a Frank Lloyd Wright term, where he promoted the destruction of the box. So where the form itself has now been atomized. So at this point, you're starting to take each of the elements and transform them into their own kind of elements. And in between here is where the space occurs. And if you start to zoom in on these, you start to get a little bit more of the more contemporary design idea where things are starting to go asymmetrical and more fragmented into each piece. So you can see they're starting to become a little bit more atomized, or in this case, I'm considering it being form gets figuralized. So the actual basic form becomes its own figure. So the form becomes the important piece to it. So in this case, we're really demonstrating the ability to express geometries in different arrangements. So, and to some degree, we're basically zooming in on the ornamentation of it. So in this case here, we're starting to zoom in and becoming the actual figured elements become the actual formalized structure of the building. So you can see in this case, we're starting to get a very deconstructivist looking building or very fragmented, where we essentially have just zoomed in on one of these elements of the ornamentation. So you can see they basically reverse the process. So in traditional methods, we will normally have our form and then we'll experience the form infigured. In this case, we'll experience the expression of each one of these points and how they radiate out the initial form, that we will then infer the idea that there's this underlying structural element to this, which would be the underlying form. In this case, we are fundamentally transforming the basic form into a new figuralized element. So you kind of reverse the process. And in this case, we're actually taking the actual figuralized element and making that into form. All right, so that's kind of a little more abstracted diagrammatic demonstration of that, but let's go ahead and see how this can be applied a little bit differently. I also have this little slide here describing the two different approaches. So in one degree, you have our perspective of looking at the whole and saying, yes, this is a mammoth, versus the other idea of looking through our telescope and examining in to find exactly what this element is, and he determines that it is a mammoth as well. So it's basically two different approaches. One is looking at it very closely and saying that they're all just these parts colliding together. It's a very mechanistic worldview. And the other one is looking at it a little more holistically as the whole. So he can identify from the overall experience that this is a mammal, which in this case, this person is looking at the individual parts of it and determining that it's a mammoth. So I have here another simple idea of how methods for showing off the figuralization of form. So you can see in this level here, we have a very schematic diagram of an overall structure that identifies this element here. So one method that is used in architecture or in Catholic architecture is the method of subdividing or rounding out the surface. So you'll notice in a lot of the architecture, we have a lot of rounded, more smoothed out and more figuralized pieces here. So subdivision is another way of kind of getting the figuralized form to this understanding. So typically, we'll experience the element this way. It has a very natural, very human, very organic feel to it, and we'll extrapolate out that this is the underlying schematic or the essence of what this element is here. To some degree, modernism has reversed the process where basically we remove all of the subdivision and try to keep out the purity of the harshness of the form here. So it's in some degree, it's taking the abstraction and making that into the actual form of the building versus having the abstracted element and then infiguralizing it or infleshing it, for this would be the final result of the building. So a little bit more on that. You can see in Catholic sacred architecture, there's been a long history and a tradition of using Euclidean geometry and different transformation of that geometry to provide underlying organization and formal order to a building. In this diagram here, it's just kind of showing the idea of a structural understanding of a building, that it's basically the lineaments would be an Alberti term. Connecting all the elements and their arrangement and their angles between is what defines the formal ordering of the building. So if you could start with this element and then inflesh it, you'd be following a traditional Catholic approach to this. So one way you could understand this also is taking the analogy that this would be the word. This is the way, the underlying order and structure to what is being expressed. This could be understood as the word. And then how that gets infleshed is what makes it into a visible and expressible and experiential aspect of the Catholic Church. So in this diagrams here, you can kind of see some underlying formal ordering to the building, something that you would not necessarily experience because typically these would be done in floor plan, and we'll normally experience these in elevation or walking through the building. But these formal ordering patterns will be overlaid on top of the building to give it some kind of a structure and some kind of order, and more importantly, it gives it some form of hierarchy. And you can see even in elevation, some of these elements were included as well. The formal language is using this scaffolding, or is another way of kind of understanding it. There's this hidden underlying ordering and scaffolding arrangement of the building. So all these lines along here would be what would be considered the formal language of architecture. Typically, it's relationships between Euclidean geometries and angles throughout the geometry there. And then you can see our next step will be in fleshing it. So you can see at this point, we're really trying to express an element here where two pieces come together. There's an expression of that intersection between those two opposing elements there. So you can see in here a little bit more of a Gothic idea where they're using an underlying formal language to arrange the order and structure behind the building. But yet the enfleshment of it becomes the filigree and the fractal elements that encase the structure there. So one way to think about that is the underlying schematic or the formal ordering of it is the word, and became flesh is the visible element of it, the materiality of this form as we experience the building. And you can see here another one in the elevation from a Brunelleschi building here showing the golden square as a way of ordering all of these elements into golden sections here. So to kind of summarize, this is a little bit of a simplified idea of what the scaffolding or the structural formal ordering structure of a building is. You can see in here kind of the lines here that were used to construct this, and then as the overall shape is then broken down or segmented or divided or segmented up or fractalized, it starts to become fleshed with the other elements inside of it. So as we start to talk about the figural language of Catholic sacred architecture, we can use the analogy of fractals. You can see over here we have this fractal geometry which is generated through a computer, which is able to generate very organic looking elements. But you can see underlying all the visual expression of the fractal is this underlying structural framework that organizes the whole pattern of all of these fractals. Now typically you would not see all of these lines and you would just see this expression of the fractaling elements here. And we've been able to use that to help replicate a lot of organic growth elements. The gist of it is that the formal structuring is the invisible lines behind it, and the figural language is what actually gets expressed as the overall figure of the object. You can see in here, these are some ideas of how the fractal patterning can work. That will start with elements, transform them, subdivide them, transform them, scale them down, transform them, scale them. So that repetition of the patterning basically fills up space and gives us something visible to look at. In this triangle element, it's basically one triangle that just keeps getting subdivided and repeated over and over and over again, and it starts to provide a two-dimensional surface that we can actually start to see. So it's basically taking an element like this that is two-dimensional lines and starting to give it a 2.5 dimension or a surface dimension to it so we can actually start to see the underlying structure. That is in essence what Catholic sacred architecture tries to express. You can see here in the Apse of Saint Denis that this was the beginning of the Gothic expression in Catholicism, where we had an underlying organizational structure behind the building, that these would not be actually seen in the building, but you could be sensed and felt and understood. But then the expression of that becomes in the materialization of it and the ornamentation and how the underlying structural pieces gets expressed. So this would be considered the enfleshment of this formal structure, or the figure on top of the formal structure. And you can see this kind of throughout all of Catholic sacred architecture. You can see here in the Baroque style that we have what I would consider the formal ordering of it that has been infigured or enfleshed. And you can definitely say that this is very fleshy. I mean, that's one of the characteristics of a Baroque architecture, that has a very rich, enfleshed feel to it. Now, what's interesting is that the form in the Baroque has started to go and deviate a little bit more from these pure Euclidean and Platonic solids, and it started to get in the elliptical and more deformed geometry. So in this case, the form is starting to get infigured as well. It's starting to get a little bit more distorted. You can see in this image here, we have All Saints Catholic Church in Virginia, where we have basically the form as flesh. So there's really no element inside of here that offers the surface expression of it. So if you can go back to our fractal element here, where we had the form, the geometric underlying organizational and structure of it, has not really been fractalized or allowed to be two-dimensionally expressed in its surface or its materiality. So you can see inside here, in contrast between the form infigured versus form as flesh, we're losing some stuff. Okay, we're starting to get these hard geometric lines. There is some expression of it. I mean, the lights in it do start to reveal the surface inside of here. But overall, it's really trying to focus on expressing the form as the flesh. It's almost just the skeleton. So it's another way of kind of thinking about that is that we have the skeleton without the flesh. Kind of one way of thinking about it. You know, there are elements inside of here that do start to subdivide and flesh it. You can see on the end of the pews, they do start to soften that out. But even inside the baptistry here, you can see it's still really trying to express that form as the actual flesh. Okay. And that's kind of where we get the term of like brutalist architecture, where you're starting to see just the pure structure of it, the structural steel of a building. So we have a couple here more examples of a little bit more expressionism. This is Le Corbusier's Notre Dame des Huttes in Ronchamp, France. It was one of his later designs where he shifted quite a bit in his methodology. Before, he was pretty close to really trying to express form as flesh, although he probably did a little bit better than this one. But in this case, he was trying to do a little bit more as pure expressionism. So in this case, there really is, it's very difficult. There is an underlying ordering to this one. So I think that's what kind of makes it not completely irrational. There is an underlying geometrical ordering to this one, but it is so abstracted out that it does become hard to understand or grasp this building in its entirety. So I can see let me go back here a step. In this one, it's pretty easy to understand. We have a lot of symmetry to it, and it's repeated elements that I can understand one bay. I basically now understand all the other bays, and I can see that there's a symmetry to these that helps me to grasp the idea of this a little bit easier than what is happening inside of this element. And that is purely on purpose. I think the architect on this one was purely trying to go towards more figuralized expression. So in this case, he's allowing you to feel your way through the building. There's no way to actually conceptualize your way through the building. So because there's a lack of that formal ordering that you're able to read very easily, you're going to have to use your embodied sense to get through this building. So you're going to have to feel your way through this building, and I think that's the purpose of it. And to some degree, that can be very frustrating for people to experience this, that they can't grasp what this building is. I mean, that's the first question you might ask is, what is this building? When you're speaking of whatness, you're speaking of its formalized ordering here. In this case, we have Richard Meyer's Jubilee Church in Rome, where he's doing a similar idea. However, here, he's not so much doing the figural expression, or figure as form. Here he's taking the form and just figuralizing the form. So he's taking geometric shapes, very abstracted two-dimensional shapes, and figuralizing it. So we can kind of look back at our earlier diagram here, where I expressed this. He's probably looking a little bit more towards the form has been completely figuralized. So he's in this realm here. He's not going for a complete expression of it. And you can say the same idea for this one as this building, in that this one is very hard to conceptualize. Now, it's a little bit easier to understand because there are some geometric repetition of elements and there's some repeating elements. So it does make it a little bit easier to grasp, but once again, it's still abstracted out into forms and shapes that have been figuralized or fractalized to some degree, or organized or transformed a little bit to add some complexity to this building. And you can see between these three, I've kind of put a couple more here, which express the dynamic interplay of the Word became flesh. So in this case, one way to interpret this would be that this is expressing or trying to get at the very hard conceptual idea of the form. Okay, so this one's really expressing possibly the Word, okay, but it's not really in flesh. So this is really trying to get to a more mental conceptual idea of a building. This one's very similar as well. Now it has been softened and fractalized a little bit, or subdivided. If you remember back where I showed the rectangle object that's been curved out, it does start to get a sense of figuralness to it. Now what is giving that sense is the idea of these gradients across the wall. In this case, we really are shooting for blank flatness on these walls, so it's really starting to push these into two-dimensional shapes. In this case, we are starting to figuralize it a little bit more. Okay, so you probably would say that this one has a little bit more softness to it, right? So this one's an early church around circa 310, where we have form. Okay, we can almost see they're almost identical between these two churches here, but it also does have these elements of fractalizing or breaking it down into smaller pieces. Okay, in this case, they're really shooting for the overall large form, and in this case here, we're trying to break it down into smaller pieces and bringing it down in a little bit more level of scale. I think the stonework in there helps quite a bit as well. So these are three more ideas of churches. So you can ask the question, which one expresses the dynamic interplay between the Word became flesh? Or another way to think about it is the formal languages of architecture, the geometric languages of architecture, the structuring and ordering principles behind architecture, and the enfleshment of it, the actually giving it the surface material that expresses that form. So you can see in this case, it's really trying to diminish the idea of the flesh, okay? And it's really trying to push this idea of pure form. So to some degree, you could say that this one is really trying to express the Word, the conceptual understanding of this building, and not so much the connatural or the enfleshment or the bodily understanding of this. You can look at this and get it right away. The concept behind it is pretty clear. Big rectangle box with some squares on it. So it's pretty easy to say exactly what this building is. And at a formal level, it's probably very difficult to say what it is on a Catholic Church level, because typically the Catholic Church will have a lot of enfleshment to it, or figuralization of the building. So you can see inside of here, we do have a lot of clean, legible, easy to read forms. We understand the structure behind this one rather easily. It's just basically a big rectangle. However, it does have some of the subdividing and fractalization of it, or enfleshment of it. You can see repeated elements. They kind of scale up as they go along. Plus, there's a lot of the texture along each one of these surfaces that give you smaller elements to read. So in this case, it is trying to express the enfleshment of it. The materiality, though the actual surfaces are important, what they're made of, and the smaller pieces of that are important on that one as well. And you can see that in each element, you can start to see the form is expressed, like this top line has got an ornamental expression on top of it. These edges are expressed with a little bit of a change. You can see between here that edge is not trying to be expressed at all. Excuse me, at all. You see this edge is trying to be as hard and as contrasty as possible. In this case, there is a mediating term between the two. And you can see here another idea of the form. We can really understand this form pretty easily, but it has been enfleshed with a lot of different elements at each of the intersecting pieces. Okay, so hopefully that gives you an idea of what a Catholic Church does. Is it's trying to express the incarnational principle of the Word becoming flesh. And the goal of a Catholic Church is to express that as dynamically as possible. And traditionally, the goal is to have strong formal understanding of it, held in tension with strong figural understanding or expression of that form. All right, so that wraps up our webinar on this, what makes a Catholic Church Catholic. Hope this helped you understand this a little bit and gave you a little bit more of a language and an understanding so that you can look at Catholic sacred architecture and interpret it And ultimately, the goal of Catholic Church architecture is to express the incarnational principle. That is, the Word became flesh. All right, take care. We'll see you.